So, welcome, friends. I'm John, Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitudes Center Zoom session with our friend today, Brad Wolf, who will reflect with us on the great Philip Berrigan and his writings on peace and disarmament. You can find many other wonderful upcoming Zooms at www.beatitudecenter.org. First, let me remind everyone who's live to mute themselves and to write any questions for Brad in the chat link. And I'm hoping Brad will speak for 45 minutes or even longer, and then we'll open it up for questions for 30 or 45 minutes and send out the Zoom recording in a few days. And if anyone wants to stay on for a few minutes afterwards, you're very welcome. So let's begin with a little prayer. And so I invite you to take a moment of silence here and to just take a deep breath and relax and center yourselves in the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely. And let's welcome the nonviolent Jesus here into our hearts and our circle, and just ask for whatever graces and blessings we need. Beloved God, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect with Brad on the life, witness, and writings of your servant Philip Berrigan, and inspire us to do what we can to resist and help end war, especially the U.S.-backed Israeli war in Gaza, the Russian war in Ukraine with U.S. funding and NATO and all our funding of these and other wars, and to help abolish war itself and nuclear weapons, poverty, racism, and violence, that we might do our part to help create a more just, nonviolent world as you intended, that like Phil, we might take seriously the life and witness of the nonviolent Jesus and welcome your reign of peace, love, and nonviolence here on earth, that we might be who you created us to be, your beloved sons and daughters, your holy peacemakers. We ask this mighty blessing in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So I'm just playing here for a moment and trying to figure out how to get. So it's my pleasure today to welcome my friend Brad Wolf, who'll be talking about my friend Philip Berrigan. And as you may have read in the notice that I put out, because Brad's been on these Zooms. I hope you've all met Brad before. But early on in the pandemic, Brad asked me on the phone one day, "When are you going to edit a collection of Phil's writings?" And I said, "Hey, Brad, why don't you do it?" And lo and behold, he did it. And I was just telling him that I was looking at this book yesterday. It came out just a few months ago, A Ministry of Risk, Writings on Peace and Nonviolence, Philip Berrigan, edited with an introduction by Brad Wolf, and it has afterwards and forwards by Frida Berrigan, Bill Wiley Kellerman, and I wrote an afterward. It's fantastic, everybody. It's really an amazing accomplishment, Brad. Congratulations. And I hope everybody who sees this will get a copy, because Phil is a very important holy prophet of the God of peace for us in this country, in the empire. And we need to listen to Phil. Brad is a lawyer, former prosecutor, director of Peace Action Lancaster, leader with Kathy Kelly and other friends of the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. I hope you've all visited that, been part of it. You want to write down the website, www.merchantsofdeath.org. Brad spent the pandemic researching and reading Phil's writings at the archives at Cornell and DePaul University in Chicago. And he's also just back from Hiroshima in Japan, where he was speaking at a peace conference. And Brad and his family live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he's coming to us today. So, dear friends, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our friend and speaker, Brad Wolf. The floor is yours, Brad.
Thank you, John, and thank you, everybody. Yeah, it's really an honor to be here. It was an honor to work on this book and to immerse myself in Phil's writings. And I've got to say right at the beginning that the book would not have happened if it was not for John, because yeah, I talked to John initially about it during the pandemic. But once I started, I'd never written a book before. So this was all new to me. So once I started, I had a million questions, and I always went to John with the questions, and he always had the answers. It's great advice, editorial advice, writing advice, but also encouragement. And so I'm really appreciative, John, of that. And John is the one who took it to Fordham University Press and said, you need to publish this book. You need to have this in your catalog. And if it weren't for that, there wouldn't be a book. So that was a huge help, and thanks for that, and thanks for having me on today. And yeah, as John mentioned, I was in Hiroshima in June as part of it's a People's Tribunal that's taking a look at the 70,000 Korean victims who were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, and they were there as forced labor brought there by the Japanese. I didn't know anything about that until I was asked to be a part of this People's Tribunal. And I think it's important as we approach Hiroshima Day coming up this week that we kind of reflect on the fact that the bomb continues to kill generation after generation, because when we were in Hiroshima, we met first generation survivors, second generation survivors, third generation survivors of the bomb, all carrying atomic cancers. And the Koreans, the 70,000 Koreans who were the unintended victims and just happened to be there. Again, the bomb kind of carries out and does its malicious work on all of these people. And the bomb was so big in Phil Berrigan's life, I couldn't help but kind of think of Phil when I was there on this very unsettled ground of the city of Hiroshima. And Phil wrote about the bomb in his autobiography, Fighting the Lamb's War. He writes about it when he was in World War II and he was a soldier. And I'll get into this a little later, but he was very happy at the time when the bomb went off. He thought that this was a good thing, like everybody else. It's going to end the war. We're not going to have to go into Japan. And besides, it was payback, as he says. Later, the more he read and the more he learned, he recognized what a horrific act against humanity and against God's creation this was. And so, as I do this research over the last 4 years, I discovered that Phil was on a constant journey trying to evolve. And he used this phrase again and again, and it was becoming fully human. And it was always the act of becoming, right? You're always in this act of becoming fully human. And that was something that he was constantly working toward, very honest about his flaws and things like that, but always striving to become fully human and imploring us to do the same. So hopefully I can convey some of that this afternoon, some of the excitement I had in discovering the writings and the works of Phil, because I never met Phil. I only got to know him through his writings. And that was a very interesting process for me, very powerful. And I hope that some of that comes through today as we cover a lot of ground. And I hope I can get I hope I can get through it all. So the Berrigan papers are kept in the archives at Cornell University and DePaul University. And I went there to do the research. And the first day when I was in Cornell, down in the archives, I'm going through the cartons. I asked for certain cartons to be brought out. And about an hour or two into the process that day, I pull out this one type speech of Phil's. And these cartons are filled with articles and handwritten journals and everything that Phil wrote on church hymnals, arrest warrants. He was constantly writing stuff down on whatever scrap of paper he could find. And I pulled out this one speech, and it was titled A Ministry of Risk and Liberation. And as soon as I saw that title, I thought, that's the title of the book, A Ministry of Risk. That's perfect. It's poetic. It describes Phil's life of risk, of how he has to undertake this element of risk in order to fulfill his obligations, both spiritual and moral. But it also kind of lent itself, the title, I thought, to all of us, because we all can engage in a ministry of risk. We all can undertake a ministry of risk. So I thought this would be sort of a shared experience, and this book could be a shared experience. And for those of us who read it, could have a shared ministry of risk along with Phil Berrigan. And that ministry might be different for each of us. We're not all called to spend 11 years in prison, but we are all called to do something, to take some kind of risk in order to try to have peace in this world. So on that first day, I knew that this book was probably going to work out pretty well. That title helped frame it. It helped me organize the materials in it. And I brought all these materials home. And because this was the first time I'd ever worked on the book, the process I used was to simply take my iPhone and photograph every page of every document that I thought was relevant. And so if there was a 10-page speech, that was 10 photographs. And I would come home each evening from the archives with hundreds of photographs. And then eventually coming home from DePaul and Cornell with just hundreds of photos that I then dictated out loud into my laptop with the voice recognition system. And then I could start editing all Phil's works because a lot of them were very long with lots of names and dates that were really no longer relevant. So I had to find a way to get the documents into my laptop. And I'm sure there's an easier way, but that's all I could think of at the time. But the benefit of that was really interesting because saying Phil's words out loud, reciting all of his speeches in his journals and everything, really had an impact on me because there's a certain ownership that you have when you say those words out loud. And oftentimes I would stop and I would think about what I had just said, what Phil had just wrote, and ask myself if I'm up to that task, if I'm up to doing what Phil has just stated. So that was all just this wonderful part of the research and the structure of the book and the way it came together. And before we just came on, Ruth Ann said, was the process difficult, the research? And I said, no, I wouldn't call it difficult. It was really joyful. It was really wonderful. And it was enlightening to do all this. So with that, I'll start with a little backstory about Philip Berrigan for those who might not know. And then we'll try to work through his theology, his peace working, the creativity he put beyond he put into his nonviolent resistance. And then definitely want to talk about Phil's legacy today, kind of what it means for all of us. So if you don't know, Phil Berrigan, one of six boys born on October 5th, 1923 in Two Harbors, Minnesota. And he's the youngest, and this is a Depression era family, right? So he's hard scrabble family, trying to eke out an existence. And his mother, Catholic, reading the Catholic Worker newspaper to the boys as they're growing up. And his father is a socialist poet, right? This poet and socialist and very sort of tough guy. And the boys are able to get the benefit of both the Catholic Worker newspaper and the Catholic Worker movement ideology, and also sort of a socialist perspective from their parents. And Phil and Dan both would write about how, despite the fact that they were desperately poor during this time, others would come to their house knocking on the door, looking for food, hoping to break bread with the family, and how their mother would always find a way to share the food with yet more people, sort of dividing the loaves again and again among the people. So this is his upbringing, and this kind of becomes a big fundamental part of his perspective about how to live in community with people. And so as World War II unfolds, we come to an important point in Phil's life. And that's the question of, does he go to war or not? And he writes very honestly in his autobiography that he wanted to go to war. He wanted to kill as many Nazis as he could. But he did stop for a second to see his older brother, Dan, at the seminary. Dan was in the Jesuits at this point. And so before he left, he goes to visit Dan just to sort of have a little period of discernment to see if this is really the right decision to go to war. But nevertheless, after the visit, he goes off. He sees a lot of action in Europe. He does a lot of things. He sees a lot of things that he comes to regret later. And so when he gets home after the war is over and he sees all of the devastation through Europe, the awful things that we all know about. When he gets home, he goes through this period of discernment where he's lost and he's trying to reconcile his faith with his actions in the war and trying to figure out what to do. And he eventually decides to join the Josephites. And there's a section in the book I want to read to you really quickly where he talks about the impact that Dan had on him and why he decided to become a Catholic priest. He writes, when Dan entered the Jesuits, he quickly superseded everyone else in the family in impact, becoming, in fact, a substitute father. It is impossible to explain in detail why this became so for me. I was searching for ideals and direction, and he supplied them. Dan's life struck me as eminently worthwhile. It had a warm and lofty quality about it, yet it was not so remote as to be inimitable. I held Dan in awe in the sense that the more I faced him, the more I had to face myself. The gap in quality between our two lives was so wide as to be intolerable. I could not endure myself and do nothing about myself. And that's kind of classic Phil. You know, he's so honest about where he stands in himself and his own failings and what he wants to strive for and how he wants to move forward. So he decides to join the Josephites, which is a Catholic order dedicated to serving African Americans. And he did so because of the racism he saw in the armed services. He was stationed down south initially. And of course, the racism there was horrific. And it continued during his service in Europe. So he comes home and he decides that this is what he wants to do. And he joins the Josephites, becomes a Catholic priest, and immediately starts organizing and talking about and writing articles about segregation and civil rights. And this is not what the church in the 1950s wanted of Philip Berrigan or of any of its priests. They wanted them to simply serve in the schools or the parishes, do the work, remain quiet, not agitate or upset or do anything like that. So the more Phil spoke out and the more he organized, and he was organizing a lot of the African Americans who were tenants in, basically slum landlord housing, and he was trying to get tenant rights and things like that. The more he would organize for that, the more he would be moved around from one diocese to the other by the church. And they're trying to silence him each time. And this is sort of a pattern that unfolds over the many years of Phil with his church. So each time he's moved, they think that they can silence him and put him somewhere, and yet it doesn't work because he just organizes again there. And he speaks out against the white Catholic parishioners who are very upset about what he is telling them. He's speaking the truth. He's speaking it very plainly. So he eventually gets to this one point, this one document I found. It was one of the earliest writings I found on Phil. It was from 1958. And this is Phil Berrigan giving a retreat to a bunch of teenagers. Now, and I tried to imagine this. So here's Phil talking to a bunch of teens in 1958, and it's a weekend retreat, and it's Father Higgins' retreat. That's what it's labeled as. And he gives this, as I got to the end of this little typed speech that he had as to the notes that he was giving, I was really struck by the ending because I thought Phil's not just asking the kids there at the retreat this question. This is a question that Phil was likely asking of himself at this time in 1958. So he ends with this point, and he's talking to all of them, and he says, "What's it going to be with all of you? Are you going to recognize God's goodness in your behalf and submit to his desires for your salvation? Or are you going to go through life playing both ends against the middle, playing cozy, not committing yourself, sitting on the fence? These are the questions you should be asking yourself today." And I think that's the question he was asking himself. Is he going to play it cozy, sitting on the fence, sort of sitting in the middle, or is he going to take a risk? And clearly, he was being called already to do something more than simply teach in parochial schools. He was not going to be able to turn a blind eye to societal's bigger problems. And so when I read that, I thought it didn't take him long to answer that question because within a few short years, Vietnam was unfolding and he was committing himself. He was clearly not sitting on the fence. So as we get to the 1960s and Phil continues to be moved around by his church, Vietnam unfolds and he starts to see this connection between militarism, racism, and materialism. And Dorothy Day had spoken to he and Dan about this before, but now he's really understanding it and he's writing about it in detail. He writes, quote, "The tyranny we impose upon our own citizens, the African American community, that tyranny has now threatened to take an international form in the larger neighborhood of the world. Human injustice exists as a hydra, contriving a new face for every area of the world." And that's a really great metaphor that human injustice is this multi-headed hydra appearing in different places. And as we find it easier to impose tyranny on the African American community, so we do it to other populations abroad. And he also wrote, quote, segregation in the arms race are connected. The vicious seeds of one help to promote the other. So this is what I found interesting in Phil's writings was that this keen insight he had. You know, there's something that Phil was really good at, and that was connecting the dots, seeing how power works, looking behind the curtain and seeing the inner workings of an empire, and then giving it back to us in his writings. And I think Phil was really brilliant in his ability to do that. He could quickly analyze the situation. He could see all the moving parts of who wins and who loses, who's grabbing that power, and then he could provide that back to us in a very clear, insightful manner. We can do with it what we will at that point, but he's given us sort of the inner workings and how things operate. Also, during this time, as he's making these connections, and these were this is a few years before Martin Luther King started talking about the three evils of America in 1967. You know, Phil and Dorothy Day and the others are also seeing these things. But in 1962, Phil's down in New Orleans. He's stationed down there, moved yet again by the diocese to try to keep him quiet, and the Cuban Missile Crisis occurs. And this really hits Phil with a sobering blow because he sees that just a few men are in control of the fate of the entire world. And this grabs him. It doesn't so much scare him as motivate him to take action. And the same thing he sees at this time is not just the fact that the fate of the world is in the hands of a few, but he also has this keen observation, which is that when he's in New Orleans and the news comes out about where the first strike might be if the Russians launch during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if some of you were alive then, you may remember the newspapers that came out and it would have circles drawn on a map as to where the first strike, second strike. In that first strike zone circle was New Orleans, where Phil was stationed. And so what Phil saw happening after that was in the newspaper was that the middle class and upper middle class whites were able to flee that area. They packed their bags and got out. The people who were left behind were the poor, were the African Americans. And so this too led him to understand this connection between militarism and racism, materialism, right? When you're spending all this money on weapons, there's not enough money to build a sustainable economy for everybody else. Some people are going to be left behind. It's going to be those vulnerable populations. And so that's where he wrote this idea that Americans are brutalized by affluence, which I thought was a wonderful phrase, you know, to be brutalized by affluence. And if you think about that, you think, well, what does affluence do? What does wealth do? The safety and security do to us? It diverts us with all the gadgets and toys that we may have, and then it desensitizes us to the suffering, to the pain that's going on in the world, to the news that we hear. And when it does that, it dehumanizes us. So, you know, it's sort of this decaying process of diversion, desensitizing, dehumanizing. Phil, in contrast, wants to go the other way. He wants to sort of take this upward trajectory of not being dehumanized, but becoming more fully human. And so, one of the things I think you'll notice in the book, if you read it, is that the sections are arranged chronologically in order to tell Phil's story. But I also wanted this narrative to be a narrative of a man who's on this upward trajectory of becoming more fully human. And at the same time, you have this downward trajectory of the United States. These paths cross, right? They cross right about in 1960. And as the United States is devolving into violence abroad in Southeast Asia, and then later in the Middle East and Central America, and violence at home, Phil is going on this upward trajectory toward becoming more fully human, not tuning out to all of this, all of the suffering and all of the pain that's in the world. So as the war heats up in Vietnam and Phil tries his best to simply write the articles, make the speeches, and talk with government officials about the wrongness of the war, he recognizes that that's not working. It's not enough. The war is grinding on. And so he's going to have to do something more. He's going to have to take a risk. He's going to have to engage in this ministry of risk. So eventually we get to Baltimore in 1967. And most of you probably know about the draft board raid that occurred, the Baltimore Four in 1967. And I think this is a good point to sort of pause and reflect on the nature of nonviolent resistance and how it has to be recreated by every generation. And the creativity behind the action itself is so important because what Phil and his colleagues did in Baltimore in 1967 was go into a selective service office where the draft records were kept, and these paper files were what Phil referred to as human hunting licenses. And they were documents that were conscripting young men to go to Southeast Asia and kill or be killed. And so they go into the selective service office, they remove the files, and they pour blood on the files. And it's a I don't want to say it's a minor act, but for that act, Phil gets a 6-year prison sentence. Now, that's a stiff sentence for pouring blood on files. They pour the blood on the files to symbolize the spilt blood of Christ, but also to symbolize the spilt blood of Americans and Vietnamese. So if you think about the creative notion behind that act, Phil spent and his colleagues spent a while thinking about what are we going to do to wake America up to the violence that's occurring in Vietnam. We have to do something to stir the conscience, to wake them from their slumber. And so eventually the idea of the draft records became this sort of point of focus. That's a tangible item. And that's something that is calling young men abroad to go kill or be killed. So they narrowed the action down to the draft records. And then the question became, well, what do we do with the draft records? What's the most symbolic thing that we can do that's going to speak the loudest? Pouring blood on those records was a very graphic image. It was spiritual, it was moral. Of course, it was literal because it was ruining those files. And so, I was struck by the creativity behind that because, today we're always trying to think of new ways to sort of garner attention and public opinion and what can we do. The vigils and the rallies and the protests are wonderful, but you want to come up with something really that galvanizes people. So that's a wonderful way to do it. But it wasn't enough because it didn't stir the kind of debate that Phil wanted, despite the fact that he's a middle-aged white Catholic priest being arrested in the mid-1960s for pouring blood on draft files. It did not get enough attention in Phil's mind. And so while he's awaiting sentencing for that, he decides to organize another action in Catonsville, Maryland. And this action is going to be bigger. It's going to involve more people. And hopefully this is going to really be the one that stirs the international community and gets the kind of press that he wants. And so Phil goes in with his colleagues. And for this one, he encourages Dan, his brother, to participate. And they go into the selective service office in Catonsville, and they take about 400 files out in these wire metal baskets, and they had made homemade napalm. And of course, napalm was the substance that was being used in Vietnam at that time. It was that jellied, fiery liquid that would land on people and burn through the flesh to the bone. It was a horrific weapon, just terrible. So what better method to use? Blood was done once. Now they're going to do napalm on the files, which they do. They had alerted the press who were out there in the parking lot waiting for them. And as they pour the napalm on the files and they burn, they recite the Lord's Prayer, and then they wait to be arrested. So again, very creative, very clever. And I think it's something we can learn from. It reminds us all how creative we need to be to go into these nonviolent actions in order to get the attention of people. And this got the attention of people without a doubt. This made headlines around the world. It led to a trial that was covered by newspapers around the world. And a lot of people began asking questions. What is going on that a Catholic priest, middle-aged, would go do this kind of thing? Why are they willing to risk prison? And it was important for Phil that he be willing to risk prison, that he put something of himself on the line. He said he was too old to be drafted, obviously, and all these other young men were being drafted. And so he wanted to risk his liberty, his freedom, to wait for arrest and go to prison for this. The interesting thing about these draft board raids is that they started some copycat raids. Other people in the resistance movement at that time, in the anti-war movement, started doing the same because what they found out during the trial was that there were no copies kept of these draft records. So once they were destroyed, those young men were not going to be conscripted to go to Vietnam until their files could be rebuilt, which took some time. So other people started doing the same thing to other draft offices all over the country. And from 1966 to 1973, there were hundreds of draft board raids and hundreds of thousands of draft files that were burned. And so it was symbolic, yes, but it was literal because these people, these young men, literally were not being able to be called up to be sent to war. So it had a wonderful rippling effect. And, we know that this rippling effect of nonviolence can become a giant wave. It can become a tsunami that sort of overwhelms and wins. And we've seen this in other nonviolent actions, whether it's with Gandhi or with Martin Luther King. And of course, Erica Chenoweth in her great studies has, over the last 100 years, demonstrated just how powerful nonviolent resistance can be when it builds upon it like this. So Phil has done these actions. We're in the mid 60s. He's got Baltimore with a 6-year sentence. He goes out and he does Catonsville, knowing that he's going to be sentenced again and spend a long time in prison. He and Dan and others decide that rather than report to prison, they're going to become fugitives. They're going to go underground because this would be a further act of resistance. And it's not that they were attempting to escape imprisonment. They never thought for a moment that they were really going to elude the authorities forever. They knew that they would be caught, but they wanted to demonstrate again the risk that was necessary to stop the war. So they become fugitives from the law. Phil is caught rather quickly within about 12 days. But Dan goes on this sort of merry romp across the country, eluding the police and the FBI and showing up at churches speaking and doing all these things to antagonize J. Edgar Hoover to no end. But again, furthering the war effort and the resistance effort as they proceed. So when Phil goes to prison, it starts what I kind of thought of was a new segment of his life and his resistance. And it's sort of the prison witness segment, because I got to read Phil's handwritten journals when he was in prison, and some of those were published in his books. But I noticed a couple things about Phil's prison journals that I thought were unique. Number one is typically when we write journals, they're about ourselves. We're writing, how we feel and what we were doing that day and what our interests were. That's not what Phil was writing about. Phil's journals, his prison journals, were filled with observations of other prisoners. So he was very interested in how they got there, why they got there. He very quickly understood the incarceral state of the United States, how it works. And he writes at a couple of different times, many of the people who are in there for theft and burglary and drug dealing and things, had they been born in a different community and a different family, would have been CEOs of corporations. And he got it. He understood exactly how this whole system worked. And there's a quote here I have, and this is typical of sort of his approach in prison. But Phil writes, let me illustrate how imprisonment enriches understanding of life and of resistance. I've done 2 stretches in solitary confinement, one for 2 weeks, one for 4 weeks, and then 2 long fasts because of political resistance. A prolonged fast in solitary is a profoundly liberating experience. Inevitably, this question arises: what more can they do to you? And the answer is nothing. Their current legal arsenal is now empty, their ammunition is exhausted, and Goliath, with his scabbard bare, looks bewildered and defenseless. So, liberation achieved through prison, through voluntarily giving up your freedom to go to prison, and then taking yet another risk by going on these fasts and going into solitary. This is part of the process and part of this journey that Phil's on. And the 3 words that kept coming up again and again in Phil's writings were resistance, revolution, and liberation. And the more I read, the more I thought, this is probably like a roadmap for Phil. He starts off with nonviolent resistance, which leads him to an understanding that nonviolent revolution is really going to be the only way to fix all of society's ills, the really systemic problems in society. And once you understand and embrace nonviolent revolution, then you're going to be able to participate in this liberation of the soul and this liberation of the body. You will be free. And Phil seemed to be one of the freest men I had ever read about. I mean, he really was in his writings and in the way he lived. They seemed to not be able to touch him, the wardens and the prison guards and things like that. That's not to say that there weren't times in his journals when he wrote about having the doldrums or, quote, the blahs in prison. He did. And I wanted to include those in the book because I thought that was important to have that part of Phil in the book to show that you know, he's not Philip the Bold, as he had said earlier. He's just like the rest of us, but he gets through them. He works through them, and he's always finding his way through them through his faith. His faith is front and center in everything that he's doing. And though he must have read the gospel thousands of times at that point, he'd write in his journal, reading the Gospel of John today, and boy, did John knock me out when he said such and such. And it was so interesting to see how he would see yet another layer of nuance within the Gospels that would sort of energize him, encourage him, and keep him going. So Phil's undertaking this journey toward liberation, going from creative nonviolence to revolution to liberation. And he's doing it without benefit of the church. And he's doing it really in opposition to the church. The church is very critical of Phil throughout this time. And Phil, in turn, is quite critical of the church. And some of the writings that are in the book highlight Phil's criticisms of the Catholic Church. And they're very pointed, they're very direct. And he's got some wonderful phrases. One of the things I had heard when I was working on the book from different people was that Phil was not necessarily a great writer. He was a good organizer, action man, things like that. Dan was the writer. But the more I read, the more I thought, no, Phil's a wonderful writer. He's got great phrases and wonderful writing. And some of that is right here. For instance, he writes this one comment where he says, we constitute the church, and he's in prison now. So he writes, we constitute the church in chains, advocates of resistance to naked power, disproportionate wealth, racism, and war making. So the church in chains, that's a really powerful and insightful phrase. It's also a damning indictment on the church because it's he and a small group of other Catholics who are in chains, not the rest of the American church. And he wrote in that same speech, why are there not more bishops behind bars? Why are there not more priests in chains with me? But this is part of his criticism. He says the Catholic priest today in America is more of a cultural phenomenon than he is a gospel man. He's nationalistic, white supremacist, and uncritical toward affluence and its source. Now that could be said today, right? And this is in 1971, he was writing that. And then he goes on to write, Christianity today places its emphasis upon worship at the expense of the works of mercy. Christians seek in religion a divine sanction for personal pride, a philosophy that will pad and cushion them from the demands of life or allow them to deal with only its most palatable forms. And that is something I experience all the time in my own parish, right? I'll go to church today at 4:30 here in Lancaster, and I won't sense any call to action, any call to risk, but a call to comfort, a call to this sort of palatable form of Catholicism. And, Phil was on that. And it's clear from his writings that he was deeply wounded at the impotence of the Catholic Church in its resistance to confronting war and racism and materialism. And it almost seemed like it was a spiritual wound to Phil that the church wasn't doing anything about this. And on its surface, it provoked anger in Phil. But I think deeper down, it pushed Phil into this deep probing of himself, a search for the reason why the church was acting this way and how it could be changed. And in that, he was able to write and give us these writings and this assessment of why the American church was relying so much on comfort and so afraid to challenge the status quo. So it was sort of American Catholicism and its false piety that ironically pushed Phil along on his own spiritual journey. And that spiritual journey is something that we all then benefited from. So one manifestation to the answer of that questioning by Phil and the spiritual journey is Jonah House. So when he gets out of prison in 1973, the question now becomes, what comes next? How do you live Christianity over the long haul? And we get into the phase at this point of Jonah House, which is the intentional living community that he created in Baltimore with Liz McAllister and eventually with children, Frida and Jerry and Kate and others who were living in Jonah House. And they're living in community. They're creating nonviolent resistance. They're house painting for income in order to avoid paying taxes, war taxes, and things like that. And as you read about this period of Phil's life in the book, you get a sense this is how to do it over the long haul. You're gathering up food for your neighbors and for yourself, and you're living in communal resistance and a shared experience of resistance. And it also starts a period of Phil's life where he's communal man, he's family man, he's father, but he continues to go to prison. And some of the really beautiful sections I found in Phil's writings were when he was writing about Liz, his wife, Elizabeth McAllister. And for those who don't know, Elizabeth McAllister was a Catholic nun that he met in the late 1960s, and they fell in love, they married, and they had children. But Phil wrote this really wonderful section about Liz that I found deep in the writings, and I just want to share it with you. He says, I've never seen a person with less insulation between gospel and life. It almost seems that in her case, belief in the word attacks insulation, overwhelms it, throws it into retreat. That preserves her clarity, saves her from psychologizing, frees her for humor, movement, and life. So she works like a slave, but effortlessly, in cheerfulness and balance. She stays alive. She has no time for anything smacking of death, complaining, indulgence, self pity, negativity, or irritability. There is service to offer, resistance to be planned, peace to make, life to live. And so I revere her, love her, remain in no little awe of her. She is a Christian, one of the holiest and wholest of the handful of people I know. And that's a really beautiful quote. And when I found it, I sent it to Frida and said, I don't know if you are aware of this, but I found this sort of deep in the archives, and I think it's really lovely. And they thought it was wonderful too. They were very appreciative of that. So that's another side of Phil that we have, right? We have the husband, we have the father, we have the person who's capable of writing very intimate passages. When he's at Jonah House in 1980, the plowshares movement starts. And so we get into yet a different phase of Phil's life. And he's got all these phases, all these segments, all these chapters of life. And so the plowshare starts in 1980 when Phil and others decide that they're going to go in to the General Electric nuclear facility in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, which is just close to me. It's like an hour away. And it's a place where we go every Martin Luther King Day and Hiroshima Day to protest outside. They decide to go into that plant. And what they're going to do is they're going to pour the blood on the blueprints of nuclear weapons, and they're going to literally hammer on the nose cones of the weapons and of the fighter jets that are in there. So they're going to beat swords into plowshares, hence the plowshares movement. And they do this, and of course they wait for arrest, and it makes a lot of headlines, and they get a trial out of this. But once again, we have these copycat actions afterwards where other people start undertaking plowshares movements. And those plowshares movements continue to this day with people continuing to do this everywhere. Right now, our colleague, our friend, many of you know, Susan Crane, is in prison in Germany for having committed a plowshares action in Germany at a US Air Force base. So again, when you do these acts of resistance like Phil did, you don't know what the rippling effects are going to be. You hope that they're going to continue. And in this case, they did. So Phil continues to be in and out of prison throughout the rest of his life. He's constantly writing, he's speaking. Liz McAllister is doing the same. He remains in prison right up until a few months before his death. And he's released, he's diagnosed with cancer. And when he passes, he has this last writing that he issues. Phil's last statement, unfinished, November 2002. And Liz was taking this down for him. And I'll just read a part of it. But he says, I die with the conviction held since 1968 in Catonsville that nuclear weapons are the scourge of the earth. To mine for them, manufacture them, deploy them, use them is a curse against God, the human family, and the earth itself. And that's a really powerful statement in a way of summing up so much of Phil's work. Um, and then you get to the point of, so what are we left with after Phil? What's the legacy to us? What can we continue with after 2002? And his legacy is very important because after reading so much of Phil's work, I have to say that he's not an enigma to me. He's not confusing or unclear. And though at times I wish he were, because it would be easier. His challenge would be easier to avoid. It would be easier to dilute. The audacity of his actions would be easier to ignore. But Phil's words are unambiguous, and his actions and his meaning are clear, and his source is unmistakable, and his example to us is compelling. Phil quoted this passage from prison in 1999, and it's from Luke. He said, if they do these things in the greenwood, what will they do in the dry? And what he's saying is, if they executed Christ in the green, what will they do in the dry? And his answer is, quote, if we wake up and live out the nonviolent resistance exemplified by Christ, we can discard the biblical metaphors of green and dry wood. Christ will live now and forever, and so will we. So those are very direct, unambiguous words. The call is clear what he's saying. You know, you got to wake up and live out the nonviolent resistance exemplified by Christ. He makes it sound easy, but of course it's not. Phil believed that nonviolent resistance was not only our best hope, but that it was our only hope because it's what Christ taught and enacted. Phil wrote, quote, Christ never said anything that he didn't do, never believed anything that he didn't live. And he pondered the words of Christ deeply. He took Christ literally and he lived him personally. He saw what Christ did and he sought to enact those things as best that he could. Again, Phil wrote, quote, I would suggest in all groping and hesitancy that the nature of Christian witness is the same operation that Christ endured in becoming one of us. One cannot become human until one becomes all people. And that's a really wonderful and powerful phrase to think about. And, you know, so Phil follows Christ into the breach with the victims, with all people, into prison, into derision, and into persecution. And it's there that Phil finds liberation. This nonviolent journey, it ends in freedom and liberation of the person, of the soul, and of the spirit of Philip Berrigan's. And he says, everything that can be said of Christ can be said of us, even the parallel risk between us and running the course. No one can honestly say that Christ did not possess our fears, our reluctance, our horror in dirtying himself with the soil of apathetic or frightened human beings. Yet conviction and love forced Christ into the darkness of risk, where nothing is predictable, nothing is safe, nothing to hold on to but one's faith. And so in the end, it's our faith that helps us to become more fully human, to travel that path, becoming fully human. Time and again, Phil would write about that, becoming more fully human. And his expression of that came in the form of asking himself this question: what does Christ ask of me? And that was a question that kind of haunted Phil. He wrote later, the sinless one continues to haunt me. And so that question sort of compelled Phil forward, but, you know, it was, as he said, it was sort of a haunting question. And for Phil, the answer was learned slowly and with great sacrifice. And he expressed it in these words: to stand in the breach with the victims, to resist the culture of death, to grasp that Christianity and revolution are synonymous, to understand that the true nature of Christian witness means being faithful enough to suffer and daring enough to serve, to accept that through our actions, we will constitute the church in chains. And in the end, to embrace a ministry of risk. So just going back a little bit to 1965, I want to reflect just back a second. Phil writes, I will take my stand come what may, though trembling and unworthy, with the millions of peacemakers across the land and in the world, men and women of every race, creed, and ideology, who through the preference of the Spirit and the providence of experience have come to see the image of God in the individual, and who intend to protect that image and elevate it to full promise. Those are beautiful words. They're beautifully written. They're deeply felt. And that is just a wonderful quote. And so I put that up there against some of the great nonviolent writings that are out there. And so while Phil's nonviolent actions were for the victims, his writings are for us. They're a critical part of his legacy. They're his way of speaking to us in the 21st century. His writings are poetic, they're prophetic. And by prophetic, I mean fierce, clear eyed in seeing the world as it is and calling out the conditions of the world. He sees the truth, he speaks it, and he acts on it. He seems to me to be both sentry and a shepherd, sort of guiding us, but also calling to us at the same time. A few years before Phil passed, he gave us an essay that contains a stirring and really beautiful call to action. It's one where he's again sort of wrestling with this issue of light, and it's a quote I'm going to end with. I think we're getting close to the time. So the quote is this: "The Word of God tells us that life is too precious to live any other way but awake. The truth or light keeps us awake. We need the light to shine on ourselves, certainly, on our fears, illusions, and denials. But just as urgently, we need light to shine on our government and its darkness of lies, secrecy, and mass murders. Confronting evil is the ultimate test of God's life. Such action becomes light for us. Life is there, and the light depends on us." And that's a really powerful way to end that. The light depends on us. That is Phil speaking to us today, calling to us, compelling us to go forward, to undertake our own ministry of risk. And that's part of his legacy, and it'll become part of our legacy. The call comes to us. And so then we say, what is our response to that call? And so I'll end there and turn it back over to John, to you, and to others with any questions you can have.
Brad, thank you so much for a breathtaking and beautiful and brilliant reflection. Everybody, how about a round of applause for Brad's hard work and brilliant talk, Brad, brilliant and really helpful to me and healing as well for my friend. I'm so moved. I mean, Dan and Phil are the two most important people in my life, have always been and are still. And you really have, for the first time in my life, I've heard someone put Phil in a context and share his good message. I've never heard that before like that, Brad. So thank you. I want to call on three friends who knew Phil in this order: Kathy Kelly, then Crystal, then Art Laffin, just to offer a word or response or a question for Brad. And as they're thinking, I brought two show and tell items. You know, I was friends with Phil for 20 years and with him when he died. This is our picture the day before we're driving to North Carolina to walk onto the military base and do our plowshares actions, December 1993. And we're standing in front of the Pentagon, about to commit several felonies. I mean, Phil and I could run for president. And then that's my little joke. This is, there's glare, but this is a great picture of Phil a month before he died. And I don't know, can you all see that, Brad? Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
It's the glare. And you see it's at Jonah House and the great icon of Jonah behind him. This was on the front page of the Baltimore Sun, I think, when Phil died. They had just interviewed him. And it's kind of real Phil. Well, Brad, you did an exquisite job. So let me turn to Kathy and see any. Let Kathy respond to Brad. She knew Phil. Go ahead, Kathy.
Hmm. Well, Brad, I certainly thought, oh, I need time to go back and reread the book.
Yeah.
Great. You were our sentry and our guide through Phil's very, very brilliant life. And I agree with you about the clarity. And so there was a time when a number of us had decided to go to a missile silo site in Missouri that was being shut down. And this was after all of us had, or most of us had gone to prison for some time in the course of trying to shut down these places where intercontinental ballistic missiles were buried under the ground. And we were going to camp out and tell the government we wanted this site to be turned into a museum that would help, condemn the whole idea of nuclear weapons. And Phil Berrigan drove out from Washington, D.C. to join us. And he was going to speak with us. We were going to converse with the great Phil Berrigan. We were so excited. Word came. Now, remember, this is when there weren't cell phones, but word came that Mitch McConnell had died and Mitch had taken his own life. And Phil and I'm sorry, I don't remember who he drove out with, but they said goodbye and went right back to Washington, D.C.
Mitch
to
Snyder.
Mitch Snyder. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I said Mitch McConnell, Mitch Snyder. And Mitch Snyder was a close friend, a comrade in many, many ways. And it just spoke so much about Phil's vital commitment to his friends, to his family, to the people whom he deeply loved. But also, as Brad kept going back to again and again during this presentation, he saw himself as part of the human family and the body of Christ, and he wanted to be the Christ who was there for all, that was what it would mean to become more fully human. So I suppose, it requires humility on the part of all of us to think that we could follow in his footsteps. And yet also, when he said Liz didn't psychologize her way out of things, she took out the insulation and was right there wanting to be a truly devout follower of Jesus who didn't die of old age. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kathy. Brad, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean yeah, thank you for that, Kathy. And it's so true in terms of where what Phil saw as his place in it. He's in his journals, he's very honest about his personality, which at times could be domineering and overbearing, and he would ratchet himself back and he would try to ratchet himself back and share in this with all people, right? And one thing I forgot to read was the basic quote of A Ministry of Risk, which kind of, embodies this. And it's where I got the title, and it gives you something of how he sees himself in that. And he says, a ministry of risk goes unerringly to the side of the victims, to those threatened or destroyed by greed, prejudice, and war. And from the side of those victims, it teaches two simple, indispensable lessons. Number one, that we all belong in the ditch or in the breach with the victims. And number two, that until we go to the ditch or into the breach, victimizing will not cease. And I think that's really the way he saw his life, he saw his witness, and he saw his work. And he was imploring all of us to try to do the same.
Thank you, Brad. And thank you, Kathy. I'm thinking, maybe you too, Kathy. Phil drove relentlessly in a car. And I'm moved by your story. He's going to drive out to see you in St. Louis. I remember when we were in prison and he said that, he was out on bail after Catonsville or no, yeah, for a little bit. And anyway, there was a window of time. And Brad, I don't know if you realize this or if I told you, all of those 300 draft board raids, Phil was behind each one of them, even if he didn't meet them. So nearly most of them, he drove. So he's in jail telling me, it would be Monday morning. I drove from New York to Chicago, took 2 days. I did a 2 day conference. I got just to meet three people who were going to do a draft board raid. And then I drove 2 days to Boston and I met two people who are going to do a draft. And he did this for months, living in a little Volkswagen. And Dan is writing him a letter. What are you doing? And Dan writes, "Oh, I'm sitting in Cornell writing a play." And Phil was so furious. He's telling me this in jail. Here I'm working so hard, driving, organizing, and Dan's up there sitting there in the Cornell writing a play. Of course, it's the trial of the Catonsville Nine, which told the whole world. To this day, it's been performed 3 times in this country this year. And Phil's telling me he couldn't compete with that. But I was very moved that Phil, as an organizer, was driving just to meet 3 or 4 people to do an action every week. He did it with me. I drove around the country with him and with Mitch, and to go and meet a handful of people to do an action. For some reason, we went to Atlanta together. I don't even know why. And he was a terrible driver too. And there's that commitment. Um, Thanks for letting me share that. Crystal, any thoughts or reactions?
Yes. When I was 7, my family moved to Mexico, and I became friends with a wonderful indigenous girl who I witnessed being horribly, horribly treated just because she was poor. And at 10, I committed myself to using my life to make a better world. But I didn't know how to do that. Nobody was doing that. So some years later, when I'm a teenager, I come across this newspaper who has an article about Phil Berrigan, who I didn't know. And I thought, wow,
Yeah.
he's a real Christian, and he's the only one I know. So he began to have a real influence on my life. And later I did an action with Larry Ferlazzo, Larry Purcell, and Dan Delaney. And we broke into Lockheed Missiles and Space Corporation and threw blood on the Trident missile, and also opened up the file cabinet and took out the notices, or what do you call that? Scripts for how to make the bomb, and threw blood on it. And Phil came to visit us, just like you were saying, John. And so I really think that who I am today,
Mhm.
I owe to Phil. So I'm so grateful to you, Brad, for all you've shared today and all that your book must have. I can't wait to read it. So thank you, thank you. And I'm so happy to be here with everyone who care about Phil.
Thank you, Crystal. Brad?
Thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, I mean, people will say thank you to me for the book and everything, and I feel odd hearing that because it was a gift to me to research and to write the book and to learn so much about Phil and to meet so many people who knew Phil. You know, I got calls from folks who heard about the book and would call me up and just share stories about Phil, and they were so excited that a book was coming out about Phil's writings, and it was great. I mean, the whole process was a gift. Like I can't call it work. I really can't. It was just sometimes it felt like a treasure hunt, you know, like because I knew I was discovering gold. Like these writings were so fantastic and things like that. But it was, yeah, it was a joy, and I appreciate you saying thank you, but I feel kind of odd with that because it was just such a wonderful experience. And you know, when it was done and that last iteration of the manuscript went in for publication, it's kind of sad. You know, it's like, well, now what? You know, I mean, I know that there's going to be promotion and things, but yeah, there wasn't more of that work, more of that discovery, more of that going down into the archives and uncovering new riches and new ideas and new writings by Phil. At one point, when I was in DePaul University in Chicago, There was a box that had all of his arrest warrants just for like a year and a half in the 90s. And I laid them all out on the table, all these different warrants and court summons, and took a picture of them. And it was really funny because two of them had not even been opened. He didn't even bother to open them. So I thought that was classic Phil. He's just like, just let them go. So yeah, having days like that in the archives and discovering writings like that and things like that were just wonderful.
That's great. And everyone, Crystal will be here in 2 weeks doing another great presentation on her journey in nuclear disarmament and solidarity with the elephants, and therefore as a peacemaker. I really urge everybody to come and hear Crystal August 17th, okay? And bring 20 friends. It'll be great. I want to, Crystal, by the way, it's interesting you say, because Jim Wallace says this, that Dan and Phil were the only Christians that they saw, except for Martin Luther King, who sort of doesn't count, and Dorothy Day. They're superstars. It makes me think, everybody, how they just did stuff publicly and got the media involved. I think it was a lot easier back then, but still, we can't just be speaking to ourselves. We've got to somehow get beyond the whatever it is, the peace movement ghetto or ourselves, and be in the mainstream media, not as an ego trip, but to get the message out. Because if Dan and Phil hadn't done that, they wouldn't have changed Crystal's life and our life, things like that. And we can all think more about that. I'm going to hand it over to Art Laffin. Art, are you there somewhere? And
Sure.
any thoughts or reflections for Brad? And then Brad, if you'll respond. And I'm going to take a bathroom break. So go ahead.
Let my people go. Well, Brad, brother, thank you. Boy, what a gift, a treasure. And for somebody who didn't know Phil, to take this on is just such an extraordinary thing that you did. And as John said, and others, just so grateful for this labor of love. And as somebody who's written several books, and I mean, the research is painstaking and everything it's a real challenge for it to all come together. But brother, somehow you pulled us together, and thank you for asking me to write a little acknowledgement, as you did Kathy and others for the book. So I met Phil in 1977, and there was a warrant out for his arrest because he was part of an action at Pratt and Whitney in East Hartford, Connecticut, where there was an air show demonstrating warplanes that were used in Vietnam. And so Phil was part of this action with other friends, including John Bach. And he never came back to court for the arrest. So there was a warrant out for his arrest, and he was a guest speaker at Central Connecticut State College in New Britain, Connecticut. And I decided to go. I'd heard about Dan and Phil, and anyway, I was invited to go, and I went. And the big news was Phil going to get arrested at this talk that he was giving? And he gives the talk, and he's not arrested. He's whisked out of the back door, and I get a chance to meet him afterwards at a friend's house with others. And as has been said, made an incredible impression on me. And then a few months later, I would meet Dan. And little did I know then that they would become my mentors and friends and co-conspirators. And I just am so thankful to God that I had the privilege, as some of us had, to know Phil, to be in community with him in different ways, and to be arrested with him, to be jailed together. I agree with Steve Kelly, who during his incredible homily at Dan's funeral. He said that Phil and Dan ought to be given the honors of doctors of the church. I mean, look at these writings. They're just unbelievable. And they're so challenging and they're so honest and they're so prophetic. And I think you put it right. You know, he's a sentry, he's a shepherd, he's a nonviolent revolutionary. And meanwhile, we can't forget Dorothy Day's impact on without Dorothy Day, Phil and Dan would have been influenced the way they were. And they credit Dorothy, you know, with you know, a great admiration. And Dorothy in her writings referred to Dan and Phil as her priests, her priests. And then I just wanted to share that I'll never forget the Trident 9 Plowshares action that I was part of in 1982. And the night before, we had a liturgy at which Phil presided. And the main theme of his remarks was, faith is the antidote to fear. He would always say, faith is the antidote to fear. Here we are, these 9 of us, we're about to go into Electric Boat Shipyard, cut through fences. Some of us were in a canoe to actually canoe to the Trident, the USS Florida, which, by the way, was deployed off the coast of Gaza in November. The Trident nuclear submarine, now refitted with Tomahawk cruise missiles. But anyway, we were able to hammer and pour blood on the USS Florida Trident submarine. And I, for one, had a lot of anxiety and fear and trepidation, you know, going at 4 a.m. on July, the evening of July 4th into July 5th. So we were declaring our independence from U.S. nuclear warfighting policies and weapons. We go in and we do this action, and Phil would always say that you might not understand the action until years later, and it's true. I mean, we took that leap of faith, overcoming, walking with our fear, doing this action. We renamed the Trident the USS Auschwitz. We hung a banner on sonar equipment that said Trident, a Holocaust, an oven without walls. And then we were prosecuted on. Phil came to the trial. You know, he was in between actions, but anyway, he was just such a great support. And then we did another action in '89. Yeah. You know, similar action, Plowshares. So,
thank you.
Lastly, just when Colleen and I got married, Phil, little did we know, was a week away from going home to God. So Dan left Phil's bedside and came and presided at my wife and I's wedding. And then the day after, we went to see Phil, who was basically in and out of a coma, but he was still conscious. And his words to Colleen and I were, he opens his eyes and he says, "I'm sorry I can't give you a better reception," with a smile on his face, and he says, "Congratulations." And then he died later that week. So these are just vignettes and what, you know, and without this book and without, you know, us sharing about Phil's life, who today is going to know about Phil? And so thank you. You know, I hope this gets wide distribution. And thank you, John, for your support and inspiration and helping.
Great. Thanks, Art. Hey, Brad, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you, Art. And it's so good to see you. I hope to see you at Kirkridge over Labor Day. But thanks for sharing that. That's hearing these stories about Phil. I mean, these are just gifts to me because, as I said, I didn't meet him. So I rely on his writings, but the people that knew him and met and served with him and went to prison with him, this is fantastic. It just fills in the gaps for me. It helps understand Phil more. And, they're wonderful stories. They really are. So thanks for sharing that, Art. I really appreciate that.
Um, so while we're talking about the book, thanks, Art. I want to give a plug on behalf of Brad. Really encourage everyone to buy the book and then to go back and buy a second copy or a third and give them to key friends. As Art said, I mean, this is the way to keep Phil going. And Phil is probably the most radical person I ever knew, who was just insistent on risk and breaking the law, which legalizes mass murder in our names. And things are much worse than when Phil died 22 years ago, which is hard to believe. And maybe we all need to think about what is our next step and what risk can we pray over taking together with our friends, however small, that might bear some good fruit. I'm giving a plug here for nonviolent civil disobedience, Brad. And and the other thing, Brad, I don't know what you think about this, but I've been asked so much all my life about Dan and Phil, and I keep telling biographers, and they never put this in there. But having met so many people and being a priest and all, Dan and Phil just were obsessed with the Bible. And I don't know, I never hear anybody talk about that, but I witnessed it with them, living with both of them for a long time. Like everything was based out of the scriptures. Now, my friend Jim Lawson, who just died, he was like that. He would spend 3 hours with the scriptures every morning. And he was a busy guy. And William Sloane Coffin was like that, and Dorothy Day was like that. And we're not like that. But, we're obsessed with the news. But they were obsessed with you getting up. Oh my God, what is the Gospel of John saying? As if they'd never heard it before every day. Brad, and I can never convey that to people, what that was like, witnessing people who were so alive in the four Gospels and the other scriptures, but mainly the Gospels. And I remember I put in the afterwards, we're walking to the funeral, and Martin Sheen was being interviewed by Amy Goodman, and Amy said, "What was he like?" And Martin said he took the gospel personally. And I'd never heard anybody say that before. And I thought, wow, and that's true. Brad, what do you think about that? Phil and what did you learn from that? I guess you saw that in all the scriptures, like he would write about an obscure question like the green wood and the
Yeah.
dry wood.
Yeah. And he found the deepest meaning in passages that we all have read and yet, maybe passed over or maybe thought of only on the first layer, but not the deeper layers. And he must have read these passages so many times over the decades. And each time, a different understanding, a different comprehension, a different insight. Reading the gospel was central. It was front and center to Phil. It guided him, it motivated him. When he asked that haunting question, what does Christ ask of me? That's coming right out of the gospel. He understands Christ to be somebody who walked this earth, who articulated a particular kind of ideals and movements, and that he was to follow those. So when he would read the Gospels, he was always finding something new, something deeper, something more to penetrate and to probe and to write about. And when he would reflect in his writings about them, sometimes he would kind of write almost with a laugh, like, I was really surprised that I could have missed this all these years, this particular nuance in the gospel. And then he would write that down and figure it out. But yeah, I was always taken as I was going through his writings. That's what he came back to. That's his foundation. That's front and center to who and what drove Phil Berrigan, the gospel.
Um, I was shocked when Frida Berrigan did the Zoom. I don't remember when, a year or two ago for us, which, by the way, you can all go back and watch on YouTube. She's talking about the 100th birthday of her father, the anniversary of his birth. Was it there, Brad, that she said he's driving the kids to school and he makes them read the daily readings and they have to talk about the daily readings on
Yeah.
the way to school every
Yeah.
day for over 15 years. That's how you become Frida Berrigan, by the way, and Jerry Berrigan. Isn't that shocking? I mean, what parent would do that? But of course, Phil wanted to learn. Do you remember that, Brad?
Yeah, and he sees the Gospels the way laypersons might see poems, right? Because you read a
Yes.
poem not once or twice, but you read it throughout your life, and every time you read it, depending on what you're going through in your life, you discover something deeper in the poem. And that's how Phil approached the gospel. No matter what he was going through, he's seeing something deeper and richer, that is part of that journey of becoming more fully human, becoming
Yeah.
more of a Christian.
I thought he was treating it even like a handbook. It's amazing. Hey, does
Mhm.
anybody have a question or comment? Raise your hand or unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'm going to keep chatting away here with Brad, and nobody wants that. John Yusenchek, it's your big
Art left.
chance. Peter
Art
Wise, your big chance, man.
looks like
Go ahead
Art.
and unmute yourselves, friends, if you want to jump in.
If you see I'm in a classroom,
Who's
I'm
this? Who is this? Say
Fran.
your say your
Fran.
name again, please.
Fran.
Hi, Fran.
Okay. I'm in my one of the classrooms. I'm faith formation uh, director at our church, and I'm here because this is what I want to teach the students. You know, that we live by the gospel and all the other stuff, the memorization of all the stuff. No, I really wanted something that I could bring to, especially my confirmation class. This is perfect. And I can't wait until I read the book because I think it will have so much that I could give to these kids. I want them to understand this. This is really what Jesus is about.
Thank you. And I think the book, the Ministry of Risk book, it's a theological writing. It's a spiritual writing, but it's also a field book. It's a guidebook, as John mentioned. It's something that you can use on a day-to-day basis to guide you in your faith in this world. And I think that's what's so interesting about it as well. Phil's writings are not that esoteric that we can't apply them to ourselves and to what we're doing every day in our world, to the issues we confront in our very own community. As I walk to Mass at 4:30 today in a little bit, I'm going to go right by Binns Park where all the houseless community is present, right? It's right down at the county government building, and all those folks are right there. So you cannot help but reflect on what that means. And I cannot help but think of Phil and Dan as I walk past that on my way to go to Mass. So these are all things that are very much apparent in your community and what you can do in your community, and how you can respond. And a ministry of risk is something of a field book or a guidebook in that.
Thank you.
Thank
Hi,
you,
Brad.
Fran. Thank you, Brad. And yes, John, go on ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for your beautiful talk this afternoon. It really helped me a lot. I never met Phil. I did know Dan a bit for a period of time, and this question of what it means to be a human being was planted in my heart by him many, many years ago, and it's been kind of a theme for everything I've done in my career, teaching and counseling and everything I've done. It's always been a question I've asked my students, but your talk this afternoon has really helped kind of deepen the context and broaden it. I've had a picture of Phil on my bookcase for about 40 years. I've never met him, but now it's just really nice. It feels like a nice connection to him. So I'm really grateful for that. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And thanks
Thank
for
you.
sharing that. I'm really glad that it was, that I was able to communicate some of the sort of, the essence of Phil. And one of the things I wanted to do when I was initially talking to Phil's family, to Frida and to Jerry and to Liz, is that, I wanted to communicate the essence of Phil Berrigan in this work. I wanted to do justice to Phil because I'd never met him. I'd never published a book before, and God bless them for giving the go ahead to this project to me. I was an unknown to them, other than John had introduced me to them. And so, I wanted to try to communicate that essence of who Phil was, the full picture of the man, his faith, his witness, and his work. So I hope I succeeded. I really do.
Brad, you did great, and maybe that's a good point to sign off. You've given us a great gift, and you certainly helped me a lot. And thank you for the book. Thank you for your brilliant talk. Thank you for just being so accessible and friendly to reflect on Phil with all of us. Um, how about a little commercial announcement before we say goodbye to Brad? So again, 2 weeks from now, August 17th, our friend Crystal Parks, who you all heard, is going to be here and tell stories. So it's going to be a great way to spend an hot August day, listening to Crystal's journey to peacemaking and widening it to now Africa and before she heads off to India in solidarity with creatures. I really hope you all come. Then in early September, we have Dr. Melanie Harris. It's a brilliant young African American woman talking about climate change and the environment and women of color in the third, fourth, fifth worlds. It's just brilliant. She's written an original book called Ecofeminism. She's been with us before, and some of you heard her, and she's wonderful. Then right after that, in mid-September, we have Father Greg Boyle live from LA, Skid Row, talking about his whole life work with the gangs. He's about to publish his third big New York Times bestseller. So we're going to get a preview about that, about love. It's just fantastic. And so it goes. There's incredible Zooms going to be happening. I hope you all do me a favor and continue to promote the Beatitude Center, tell people about it, and get Brad's book. And on a closing note, Phil, given all that's happening in the world, would encourage us to really try to figure out a way to stand up publicly and resist war and nuclear weapons and any form of systemic violence, whether against the poor or against the earth. So I hope people will go forward and think about what they can do, especially this fall, depending on how things play out and what nonviolent resistance actions they can do locally, however small they seem. So, dear friends, how about we all join in giving a round of applause to Brad for a beautiful afternoon presentation? Thank you, Brad. You've done good. I'm happy to stay on with folks after the recording stops. Brad, you're welcome to, but you don't have to. Everybody have a great weekend, great life. God bless you all. See you the next time. Thanks so much. Signing off with the recording.